Zach, the United States military is heavily investing in technology, doing really good for the men and women that serve. The Army Applications Laboratory is very critical and central to that to the U.S. Army. What role does AAL play there?
Yeah, so our main mission is to get the best technology into the hands of soldiers as quickly as we can. We do this by broadening the Army's access to the civil industrial base, and specifically, this is small and non-traditional businesses for us. We like to capitalize on the agility and the innovation that newer defense companies can provide from not being mired in decades of requirements documents and acquisition programs and things like that, right? That we all know to slow things down. And so in the intent of speed to of get to soldiers as fast as we can, that's our approach.
To use the term, are we in the golden age of defense technology now? Because it seems that from a venture capital standpoint, there's a lot of venture capital going into it, and there's entrepreneurs who are finally saying, you know what, working with the United States military is cool. And so you're starting to see, at least from my perspective, a lot of really great technologies being built.
Yeah, it's certainly been very healthy the last few years. We've seen quite a few new folks getting involved in the defense space in terms of venture capital and the investment community. And I think that comes from exactly what I just mentioned, right? So many new companies in the space trying to disrupt traditional acquisition programs and requirements and things like that. And so there's an opportunity there, right, for these new companies to compete against big primes and start to take some of that ground back in terms of getting their technology into the Army. So when you couple good technology with high investment potential, I think there's a recipe there for investment in the VC community.
And one of the key things with AAL, when you look for companies, you try and find companies that have not traditionally worked with the Department of War. Is that because of agility? Is that because they don't have the membrane of how that works and they're willing to push things in different ways? Why do you look for companies that haven't traditionally worked with the DOW?
It's a good question. I think it relates to a couple of things. Number one, like I mentioned, it's one of our main missions is to broaden the Army's access to the civil industrial base, and I think one of the most effective ways to do that is by partnering with these new businesses, right? Um, they're starting up business because they've got a great reason to, right? They've developed a new technology that can be disruptive. It can be game changing. In the ideal case, it can change the way we fight for the better, right? Um, and so I think for us and our mission, seeking these companies out is a critical way to accomplish that goal. Um, a lot of times when companies are new to working to the government, they don't really know where to go or who to talk to, right? And so that's also part of why we're here. We're located in downtown Austin. We're in a co-working space called the Capital Factory. We're not on a military installation. You don't need a military ID to come talk to us. We're aiming to be accessible to these newcomers to the defense space. And so I think putting all that together creates a really healthy base of innovation for the Army to capitalize on.
It is because we want the United States military and the Army to be ahead technologically than the bad actors that we go against, and finding new technologies is, to me, based on that. You published a wonderful PDF report I encourage the audience to read about all the wonderful work that AAL does. And one of the things is that you do is DevX Autonomy, where you encourage companies to upload. You don't have to have a government ID or any of this to upload a 6-minute pitch video.
Right.
What was behind that? Because to me, it's like, okay, this is accessible. You're willing to look at a new technology. What was behind the DevX initiative?
Yeah. So as Army Applications Laboratory, we're not a laboratory in a normal sense, right? We have scientists and engineers on staff, but we're not doing experiments here, right? Instead, the way we experiment is with processes and acquisition strategies and technology adoption methods. And so one of the things that came out of that was the DevX marketplace. We've seen a repeated need, like I mentioned, getting kids to soldiers as fast as we can. And traditionally, we do that with a solicitation process. That means we're looking for specific things on a specific timeline, right? Um, but of course, it's easy to see, right, that soldiers' needs don't always line up with solicitation cycles and things like that. So if we can create, a portal that gets after systems that can take either, cognitive burden or physical danger out of the picture for soldiers, that's something that we can be delivering on consistently, right? And those technologies are improving in the civilian markets rapidly and consistently also. And so I think having a way to be able to continually incorporate those technologies into a system that's easy to use can help get after solving that problem. And so the DevX portal itself is intended to be easy to use, right? Like you say, it's a 6-minute video. Demonstrate your technology, or if you don't have something that you can demonstrate yet, talk to us about where you're going and how you want to get there. And then when our teams review that submission, it meets the competition requirement, right, for contracting, and so that enables not only us but other areas of the Army on the operational side, or labs and centers, or other stakeholders can then go and get that technology also without having to do a separate solicitation or like a topic transfer or anything like that. So the whole goal of this is to make things continually easy for the Army to incorporate the best technologies.
It's great because to me, it gives you a front row seat to early emerging technology that can go on to have a positive impact on the world. Is there anything that's
Mhm.
come through the DevX platform that's like, oh wow, like the team got really, really excited, eventually perhaps went on to fund? Is there any major breakthroughs that came through that 6-minute pitch video?
We've seen a lot of really cool things. I think without getting too specific, or maybe revealing IP that I'm not at liberty to reveal. Um, I think the main thing that we see there that excites us is not only the innovation that companies are bringing, right, but the fact that they're understanding Army problems, and these are things like, how do we integrate the technology? How do we make sure that this can work in Army systems that exist now, right? And so companies are really doing their homework and figuring that out, and saying, if we want the Army to use us, to purchase us, we have to make it as easy as possible. And so I think that's a real evolution that we're seeing on the side of industry to make the acquisition process as simple as possible on their side too.
If you look at a public example, which AAL has published, you talk about the autonomous bridging kit. Is that an example
Yes.
of a company coming to AAL saying, okay, we know historically this is a problem? I say that because my grandfather was an Army Corps of Engineers in World War II. So I've heard stories about blowing up bridges and building bridges. And I say, oh, autonomous bridges. This is great. Is that one of those
Yeah.
problems? Perhaps it was a member of the family served in World War II or Korea or Vietnam and said, okay, let's build a solution to that. Is that an example of that?
In a way, right? So as you know from your grandfather's stories, you know, bridging, and there's a couple other things like obstacle breaching, and avoiding the ways the enemy can shape the terrain against us. Um, but bridging and crossing gaps specifically is one of the most dangerous things that the Army, and specifically the combat engineers, do. And the reason for that is you're basically exposed for quite a long period, right, while you're literally building a bridge. In our case, this was a bridge across a river, or a wet gap. And so the historical way this is done is a truck comes and drops off all these sections of floating bridge. The soldiers push them off into the water, right? They float, and then it's somebody's job, right, to either be in the water holding it steady, or on top of the bridge. You're trying to align the sections and make the mechanical connections, and wrench everything down, all while being exposed, right, and subject to enemy observation, or in the worst case, attack and indirect fires and things like that. So it's a big problem that the engineers face, and so the approach that we wanted to take is, okay, what can we do to help remove some of this danger, right? And help protect the lives of our soldiers that are involved in these kind of operations. And so through the solicitation process, what we arrived at was a company who basically is figuring out how to automate each section of the bridge, right? And so they're deployed into the water. The section has a battery and an outboard motor, and then can be either remotely or autonomously controlled, right? So they can steer themselves into position. There's autonomy algorithms that can align, the link up sections and autonomously make the link ups like you would for, a train car or some other things. And so, it still takes a little bit of time. There's still, work to do for it to be, functioning exactly the way you want it to, right? But we've seen already that we think it can reduce the number of soldiers involved in this by like 90%, right down to just a few folks. And it's more of a monitor the process than do the process. And so that potentially could be a big way where we remove a lot of that harm that our soldiers face.
Incredible. It's truly incredible. If you take roughly 90% of soldiers out of harm's way, it's remarkable. Are there weight restrictions? Are there current restrictions, depth restrictions of deploying these autonomous bridges? Because when the men and women of the Army go around, they're going to all sorts of different terrains around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important, I think, to mention, and I didn't do this in my last explanation, but this is an autonomy kit that's put on top of what the bridging equipment that the Army already uses, right? So it's not a completely new development, right? It's kind of like a retrofit of an existing system, and so that means that it's usable in all the environments that the Army needs it to be used in, and it can support the types of vehicles that the Army drives around in, right? Armored vehicles, tanks, all these kinds of things are supported by this kind of system. And so I think that's another really important aspect of technology development, right? That we're seeing in the Army today is that for it to truly be useful and adopted and incorporated, it needs to be easy to use or be used in situations and contexts that we know how to operate in. If it's something that's going to be a burden to either learn how to use or a burden to bring with you, we think soldiers would probably just leave it behind. So to get those true impacts of the technology, there's other elements besides just the autonomy, right? That have to be considered, and I think that's another thing that we're seeing our companies start to do.
Do you ever think about software fatigue from a soldier standpoint? If you're introducing all these new technologies to the battlefield and all these new software elements that you could potentially run into software fatigue, where, okay, this command thing used to do this and did really good at this. Now we've got all these other gizmos and gadgets on it. Do you ever think about fatigue from a soldier interacting with that software in the field's perspective?
Sure. Yeah. And that's a great point too. Over the last, several months, 6 months to a year or so, I think the Army is doing a better job of being aware of this. We've seen the advent of something called NGC2, Next Generation Command and Control. And this is something that is, I think, aiming to get after what you're talking about, right? Where you have all these disparate systems, they all work differently, they don't talk to each other, and so you need at least one person managing each thing, and then hopefully you can find ways to aggregate the information and find ways of acting on it, right? And so where we're looking to go with NGC2 is to put architectures in place where you can connect third-party software and hardware that will be able to interact on the same systems, will be able to talk to each other, and will present a kind of like a common operating picture for commanders or logisticians or whoever needs to have access to the information that you have.
Do you see that? And this is a hypothetical scenario. I've seen videos on this, but this again is a hypothetical scenario where you can have a commander in the field that can be using a form of a tablet that can monitor the drones in the air, the autonomous ground vehicles, perhaps the autonomous bridges, and get a good overview of the operations in the field. Is that something that could potentially happen?
Yeah, I think so. And that's a little bit part of the NGC2 process. The other thing that contributes to that the Army is heavily exploring is like one to many, command and control, right? Where you can have intuitive controls, like for a tablet, for example, where you can say, okay, you group of 3 UAS go explore to the west. You ground robots run these supplies to this forward deployed unit, and you can kind of track what that locations and status updates and things like that. I think there's quite a bit of interest in things like that, and things that will further reduce cognitive loads and take soldiers off the type of tasks that could be accomplished autonomously, and enable those soldiers to do things that either require more extensive human judgment or doing things that only soldiers can do, versus monitoring systems as they travel somewhere.
As the battlefield, I'll use the term, becomes connected and autonomous, is AAL, are you seeing an increase in startups that are trying to solve the security encryption layer of all this to ensure the safety of the men and women on the front lines in theater?
A little bit, I think. There's an element to that where the Army or the DoW will kind of have to dictate some of those requirements. Um, but I think it's almost like table stakes, right? Where if you're going to bring technology into the Army, you need to be prepared for how to protect the equipment, right, and prevent adversarial impact, either through EW or cyber or whatever it may be. Having those kinds of adverse effects. So it's critically important, and I think companies are doing a lot of right things to prepare for those types of threats.
And for the fiscal year 2027 budget, the Department of War is requesting 54.6 billion for autonomous warfare. In your opinion, is this a sign of things to come? Because reading the DoW budget request, there was a lot of references to autonomy and automation in that budget request.
Yeah, I think so, right? So coupled with a lot of things that we've talked about already, right? Autonomous bridging, autonomous breaching and terrain shaping, logistics and resupply. These are all things where there have been extensive manpower requirements historically to do, and a lot of these are extremely dangerous tasks. And so I think what we're seeing, with these projected budgets, increasing spending on autonomy, is the Army and the DoW, recognizing that we can probably do this, more efficiently and better, and without putting so many, soldiers and members of the military in harm's way.
In the AAL 2025 performance report, you spoke about the hybrid vertical takeoff and landing. Could that play a potential role in resupply missions or potential evacuation missions in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've looked at kind of both of those cases. We did a project that was specifically looking to develop the aircraft itself, as well as one that was looking at medical payloads of either landing to deliver medical supplies or, in more extreme cases, do casualty evacuation. And I think these are still areas that are really ripe for further exploration and investment on the Army side. On the aircraft part itself, the tricky part here is getting to an aircraft that functions like a helicopter without being a helicopter, right? The Army has looked into putting autonomous packages on things like Black Hawks, which has been successful, but it still requires a Black Hawk helicopter, right? Which is very expensive, and could potentially be used for other things than resupply and casualty evacuation, even though it's good at those things. And so I think the real trick here is to find ways of developing aircraft, and specifically, right, vertical takeoff and landing, because that has specific advantages to areas it can access, and it doesn't need runways, and it doesn't need pilots and things like that. But the real trick there is finding engineering advancements that can enable heavier payloads, right? And I think in some of the best cases, you're looking at like a 1-to-1 weight of the aircraft to the payload that it can carry, right? And so shifting that in a more favorable direction is going to be crucial to high mass supplies or starting to move people, and things like that. And so there's still work being done in the Army, in these areas. So I think we're going to continue to see quite a bit of work in that space.
And this is a layman question, but I'm curious though. If you look back at the history of eVTOL, it started at NASA with Mark Moore and his team published the NASA Puffin paper. Are there any collaborations between the United States Army and NASA as it relates to this technology, since it was incubated at NASA? And NASA has an incredible ability to take very large, heavy objects and move them into space?
Yeah, absolutely. Not any collaborations with NASA that I'm aware of, but it is a cross-service problem, right? We know that, like, for example, the Marine Corps has a program that's looking into very similar things than the efforts that the Army has done, and I believe the Air Force too. Not only in terms of logistics, but also delivering battlefield effects, right? EW and comms relays and things like that. I think with the goals and the approaches that the Army is taking, um, we may be able to get somewhere similar to where NASA got, but I think the pain point there for the Army is going to be cost versus numbers, right? We can have very exquisite things, but that means we can have very few exquisite things, and then we have to be very, very careful about how and when we choose to employ those kinds of things. And so, one of the angles for consideration on the Army side is how can we mass effects for the lowest cost, right, or create the greatest efficiencies in these spaces while minimizing cost. And so that kind of plays back into what I said a few minutes ago about we have Black Hawk helicopters, and
Mhm.
those are fantastic at doing a lot of things, but they're expensive. And if they're doing supply missions, that means they're not doing other things, right? And so if we can find ways of producing lower cost, or I'll even say attritable, which we take to mean the Army can accept losing them in meaningful quantities without being subject to search and rescue for pilots or things like that, right? The kinds of advantages that brings. Um, if we can start to narrow in on platforms that can start ticking those boxes, then I think we'll start to really see a lot of meaningful, battlefield effects that can be accomplished with these types of autonomy things.
Looking at the battlefield, has any learnings emerged from the Russia-Ukraine conflict? And I ask that because Ukraine open sourced the data set for autonomy. You have to get clearance to go through it, but they published some white papers on it. It was very fascinating how the Ukraine was able to make these drones very low cost. And is that something that the Army is potentially looking at from a low cost perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting problem right now, especially because everybody has seen, right, the impacts of drones and autonomy in the Ukraine conflict. Um, and that means that we not only have to figure out how we can capitalize on those effects, but how we can also defend ourselves from those effects. And so that means not only finding ways to deliver battlefield effects, cheaply, but how do we develop, the tactics and techniques to defend ourselves? That means you have to practice shooting them down, right? And if you're going to go purchase drones and try to figure out how to shoot them down, then that gets expensive really, really quickly. And so I think the more we can do to figure out how uh, to get work done on learning tactics and techniques and how to defend ourselves and how to best employ these things absolutely means we need to find ways of acquiring either the vehicles themselves or the components, and then doing some kind of level of assembly at on the unit level, um, finding ways to do that faster and cheaper. There's been a lot of great work lately with companies that are aware of this. They're trying to find parts and vehicle systems that are NDAA compliant, right? Which means we have to do our job to support the American economy and buy domestically when we can. But the downside to that is that usually raises the cost of things, right? And so um, we need to find a balance either between maybe looking at some exceptions to policy if we're just going to try to knock it down out of the sky, or finding ways of lowering the cost of domestic production for these kinds of things.
It was about 10 years ago. Mark Andreessen from A16 introduced me to a company that was doing anti-drone technology. And they were doing it for this. This is the civilian side of the airport. It's San Diego. And obviously, one side is military installment. And the amount of recreational drones that would go over there. My wife had the greatest line ever. She called him, he's the drone killer company to this gentleman that started. It's the drone killer company. Are
Yeah,
you starting
yeah,
to see an increase of companies reaching out to AAL or anything in the market for, you want to call it, anti-drone technology emerge?
yes, absolutely. So we've seen with the conflict in Iran going on right now. That it's a bit of a logistics problem and a manufacturing problem when you shoot very expensive missiles at very cheap targets. And so I think we're probably approached several times a month over the last couple of months with companies saying, "Hey, I can figure out how to make cheap counter UAS technology or cheap drone interceptors and other things, right, that are designed to counter UAS threats." And there's it's a very active space for us right now, and I think it's one that the Army should look into more extensively.
On the other side of that, this is a hypothetical. Let's say the Army has an eVTOL program. It's doing resupply missions to the soldiers on the front line. Do you start to think about self-destruct technologies, so the technology that the United States military has built, put into these eVTOLs, does not get into the hands of the enemy?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I think for that one specifically, we may have to consider the type of technology that we are looking to protect versus the risk assumed in using it, right? And so if you look at something like an autonomous weapon system or autonomous helicopter, for example, or even like things like the Air Force is doing, looking at putting autonomy packages on like fighter jets, right?
Hmm.
I think in cases like that, it's probably critically more important, right, to figure out how to avoid adversarial capture of those technologies. And maybe a counterpoint to that is if you're looking at things like a ground resupply robot, maybe that's less critical, right, to protect the technology from, unless there's maybe something really really groundbreaking in the autonomy stack portion of it. Um, and so I think like a few other things, if there's a significant risk of losing the asset or like technology falling into adversarial hands, um, that may be one of the areas where we rely on the judgment call of battlefield commanders to say, hey, look, this is an acceptable risk, right? The mission necessitates that we need to use this, or maybe if it's a precious resource, we say we can use this a little more judiciously and try to protect things without um, having very exquisite or sophisticated systems on relatively low value assets and things like that.
As these new technologies emerge, that they get into the battlefield, does the Army look at the incredible pedigree of institutional knowledge that's housed at West Point, that has been meticulously archived, and study some of the Eisenhower letters, or speak to generals to get their opinion from that real world experience that these incredible men have had?
Wow, that's a really good question. I may not be the best guy to answer that. I've not been involved in the the West Point community or curriculum, but I think one of the things the Army is quite good at is incorporating battlefield lessons, right, into either future tactics or ways of using technology. Um, Maybe to not the extent of a West Point program, but there are several units that are standing up UAS schools and counter UAS schools kind of on their own, right, with their own operational funds, because they see that it's such an important and potentially drastic way to change a fight, right? And so I think the recognition of that, and especially on the operational unit side, um, means that they're learning very fast, right? And it means that they recognize that we have to get this knowledge disseminated very widely and very quickly, um, because it's something that as we've seen, it's an incredible risk, right? When you're subject to being in the area of operations of some of these systems. And so I think you know the Army has recognized this threat and is doing quite a bit to communicate how to deal with that, and innovation, right? Not only on the side of our companies, but the side of our soldiers themselves, and ways they can come up with to defend themselves from these kinds of things.
The beauty about the soldiers are they have an experience that I don't have. A majority of this audience doesn't have. They've gone through world class training to understand things and think about problems. I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day, and I said some of the most fascinating conversations I ever had are with law enforcement officials. they think of all sorts of scenarios that I would have never thought of as it relates to deploying
Yeah.
autonomy. And I'm sure it's the same thing with the men and women of the Army. On the risk side, I'm curious. So we look at the practical risk. Then to me, there's the 10,000 pound gorilla in the room, supply chain risk. Have you
Sure.
seen any companies emerge that are looking to monitor the supply chain risk? Because there's been several reports that have come out from the United States government where microchips get embedded and we can't find them until unfortunately it's too late. Do you see any companies emerge? Is that stuff that you look for as a supply chain risk?
Yeah. So part of the things that we look at when we work with a company or put a company on contract is a due diligence scan. And so we'll look at who's funding the company, right? Who are they selling equity to, and who does that investor work with, right? Um, some of these guys are very good at hiding where their money comes from, and companies can unknowingly take foreign investments, thinking that everything looks clean from their side. So it's a complicated thing, and it requires quite a bit of manpower and tools to be able to dig into these kinds of things. Uh, I think kind of like we mentioned earlier with some of the drone and counter drone technology, right? Trying to explore how to use these or shoot them down. Um, you know, we can buy things for cheaply if we don't care where they come from and what the consequences of that are. Um, but it's absolutely a persistent risk, right? That adversaries are trying to poison the well, if you will, and invest in companies that could then render them unable to operate with the DoW. So I'd say it's the things that we look at are probably less hidden components of technology and more on the back end of who's funding you and do you know who your investors are, kinds of things, which is critically important.
I was talking to an ex-CIA field officer yesterday, a matter of fact, and he said everybody's always listening somewhere, and the things about if you and I went out of the country here and there, all that's being tracked. It's truly amazing. So I give you a lot of credit for looking at that, and I do want to give you a lot of credit here to you and the entire team at AAL. The 2025 performance report that AAL published was fantastically awesome. In that, you highlighted that AAL invested just over 29 million in 2025. How did you go about that process? How did you, obviously, we talked about the due diligence, but any trends that you saw looking for those companies, and how did that come about?
Yeah, it's a I think a great question. So when we're looking at what projects or companies or technologies we want to take on, we start the process with market research, and one of the outcomes of that market research is we assign either a project or a company or a technology a technical risk score and a military utility score. And so we assign the technical risk with a matrix that we developed, and it looks at things like, for example, supply chain. It looks at the overall state of the art. What's the general maturity of the technology in the space. It looks at if we can find it. The team, who are the founders, right? Are they have they been in the space for 20 years? Do they really know what they're doing? Have they worked with the government, or are they completely new? And if they are, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But it's a factor in the way we decide how we want to make our investments. And so we plot all those things, or we weigh those things against what we call military utility, which is maybe somewhat less sophisticated in how we come up with that, which is talking about potential use cases or battlefield effects, and rate that on how decisive we think that would be as a capability. And so we actually put those numbers on an XY graph, right? Technical risk on the x-axis, military utility on the y-axis. And obviously, we want to be in the quadrant that is low technical risk and high military utility, right? And so we try to get our projects and take on things that we think are in that quadrant. We absolutely want to avoid high risk, low utility projects, right? That's just asking to kind of waste time and money. but we will sometimes operate in the high risk, high utility quadrant. These are things that maybe the civil markets haven't had a chance to either de-risk for military use, or it's a technology that's new to all markets, um, or it's something that we see that we think would be so drastically game changing that we have to take the risk on it. And we call these our moonshot projects. And so these are things where we look at the information that we have, um, and we decide whether or not we want to take on the risk, understanding that it has a greater likelihood of failure. But if we're successful, it's a 10 or 20x improvement versus a 2 or 3x improvement. And so, funny enough, I think the last couple of moonshots that we have taken on have been some of our most successful projects that we've done in the last 2 years. And so I think that's a testament to not only the great research and due diligence and things like that the team does, but the willingness of the Army to take on some risk for a greater return.
You've had two unicorn companies emerge. You're looking at 974.9 most successful exits with 550.6 million occurring in 2025. Do you measure success from the return on capital, or do you measure success for the positive impact it has on the United States Army?
Well, it's both. So the main goal is getting, like I said earlier, getting the technology in the hands of soldiers as quickly as we can. In order to do that and maintain that, it's important for companies to be financially healthy, right? Um, and so as we couple Army contracts with potential for investment, sometimes that leads to exits, right? Um, and I think the investment community, especially in the defense space, right, which is relatively new in terms of like high activity levels, right? It's quite popular at the moment. I think when you couple those things together and see what the investment community is doing and how they watch what the military is doing, um, it looks like they're ready to back who the Army thinks are going to be the early winners, right? And what I mean by that is um, they're watching to see what happens after the first or second contract, right? Which is typically going to be smaller volumes and low dollar amounts. If you look at things like an SBIR, right, it's 18 to 24 months and a couple $1 million, um, which doesn't really move the needle, right, for a lot of investors. It's the part that comes after that, and so I think if the Army is sending that demand signal back to the investment community, saying, hey, we're going to put these types of companies on contract for 10 million, 20 million, maybe more, then that sends a pretty clear signal, right, that the Army is going to be active in this space. And so for some of those investors, that means, okay, maybe this is a good time to jump in. And we see that, again, like I mentioned, in the form of various types of exits and things like that. So yeah, it's critically important, for these small non-traditional businesses that we work with, who maybe are not used to scaling, um, to either learn how to appropriately take those investments and maximize the potential of that, to deliver for the Army, and in some cases they end up taking exits and letting somebody else continue that work.
Because if AAL gets involved, it sends to me, as an investor, sends a very positive signal. And curious here, investments from AAL extend over 31 states. Have you seen any interesting trends emerge? Because you have Texas, Florida, Massachusetts around the technologies that have emerged in these pockets?
Yeah, I mean, most of them probably aren't surprising, right? So if you look at California, and the West Coast, those are obviously big in the Bay Area for traditional tech and aerospace and things like that all along the West Coast. And then if you look at say Boston and Pittsburgh, those are big hubs for robotics and autonomy and things like that. I'm sure, as you know. But I think the interesting thing about Austin is we've kind of been a startup hub since maybe the 90s or so. But the real emerging trend here has been the defense tech emergence, right, in Austin. And I think that's due to a couple of things as a recent trend. Um, Number one, Texas has positioned itself to be, very friendly to businesses, right? Especially in the defense space with, laws and policies and tax codes and things like that are advantageous to business. We also have a lot of land, right, that companies can use for, no shortages there, right, for R&D and testing of things that maybe don't have uses in civilian markets, I'll say. Um, and then couple that in the case of Austin specifically with the 4-star headquarters, in Austin, right? It used to be Army Futures Command, now it's Transformation and Training Command. Um, and then the proximity of Fort Hood, an hour away, right, where we have First Cavalry Division, three Corps, right. So when you put all those things together, I think um, that's probably a lot of the reason that you've seen Austin kind of blow up over the last couple of years as a defense tech place. All that said, right, we have companies on contract across 31 states. So just because the company isn't in one of those areas doesn't mean we won't find you, right? If you have great technology, we're interested no matter where you are.
There's a company listening to this that's developing a defense technology or technology they think would provide a net positive for the United States Army. How do they reach out? How do they get in, potentially get involved with AAL?
Yeah, I think probably the easiest way is to go to our website aal.army, and we have a tab there that's I think it's called Work With Us, and that will allow you to join our network. You'll get on a mailing list. You can tell us about the tech verticals that you're involved in, and that will help us target some of our outreach towards you. Say if we have a solicitation that matches up with your tech verticals, you'll be notified of that. We also have a corporate ventures team here at AAL. And what they do is a lot of our corporate outreach. They maintain relationships with the startup community, with the investment community, and their whole goal is working with newcomers to the Army who don't know who to talk to. And so we can set companies up with half hour one-on-one chats with our corporate ventures team. Not only that, when it's available, we travel to various conventions and trade shows and talks and things like that are at the intersections of Army demand signal and high quality companies. So we're very active in trying to get out and connect with companies. And then I'll throw in a shameless plug here at the end, where if you go to our website, aal.army, you can see opportunities that we have for solicitations. We have one that's open right now for predictive sustainment and logistics that closes on June 12th. So I'm not sure when this comes out, but hopefully there's still more time. And so that, of course, is another way that companies can work with us is learn about our solicitations and apply to those. Oh, and I'll mention one more thing. Sorry, we do a monthly webinar with our corporate ventures team that helps companies find us and connect with us. So those are published every few weeks also. So that's another way.
I'll summarize by if you're building technology that could benefit the Army, connect with AAL. And Zach, as we look to wrap up, I'll ask you one last question. What does the future of technology in the United States Army look like?
Oh wow. I think looking at technology is going to advance with or without the Army. I think technology in the Army will probably depend on the Army's willingness to adopt and to work with these cutting edge technologies and figuring out how to incorporate those technologies into the way the Army operates, like I mentioned earlier, with the least burden possible, right, and the lowest cost possible to the greatest effect. So those are all really big rocks, to break up. But I think that's those three things are probably the most critical ways that autonomy and technology will be successful in the Army.
One thing is very clear: the Army is actively embracing and deploying new technologies. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is Army Applications Lab. Zach, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy today.
Yeah, that was great fun. Thanks for having me.
Billions and soon trillions in value will be created in the autonomy economy. By the time a trend becomes consensus, the alpha is already gone. The gap between uncovering signals and reading headlines is widening fast. When it's a headline, it's no longer a signal. Enter Autonomy AI. We decode signals before they move markets, giving you conviction in the autonomy economy. Autonomy AI. Your models, our intelligence. Visit AUTNMY.ai.